Welcome back. A massive fraud lawsuit filed against former US President Donald Trump is in New York, resuming at the top of the next hour. Trump has just left his home at Trump Tower and is headed to a Manhattan court for a second consecutive day. He and his two adult sons and others are accused of repeatedly committing fraud for financial gain. The state attorney general is seeking a $250 million penalty, as well as a ban on the Trumps doing business in New York. Well, CNN legal analyst Joey Jackson joins me live to discuss. Good to see you, Joey. So
Thank you, Lynda. Good morning.
Is expected in court next hour. He's already attacked the judge in this case, which could require him to hand over $250 million. He claims the judge is interfering with an upcoming election. Is that a valid excuse or a defense in this case?
So, Lynda, it's never a wise idea to attack judges. It's certainly even less wise when the judge here is the finder of fact, right? What do I mean by that? This is a bench trial, and what that means is that this judge has to make an assessment as to whether or not those claims have been met, and the judge largely did that in a pre-trial motion that was filed. It's called a motion for summary judgment, and what that means in English is that the judge assesses whether there's any factual disputes as to necessitate a trial on those issues. The judge concluded as to the issue of fraud, there is not a factual dispute. In fact, there very much was fraud. And then you turn your attention to, well, if that's the case, what are the damages amounts? And the judge not only concluding that there's issues of fraud, but now has to move into the issue of what the penalty should be. What does the appointment of a receiver, an independent body to oversee the properties and potentially dissolve them and distribute assets, what would that look like? What would the amount of the fine look like? Should it be $250 million? Should it be somewhat less? What would the issues, right, in terms of the loss of the business certificates look like? So I say all that, Lynda, to say that if this is the person who's deciding your fate, it really is not in your interest to attack them. However, we know that there's a presidential election happening, and certainly based upon public relations, the president has to cater, right, to a certain populace who buys into him to give the narrative he's giving. But as it relates to the law, the issues and the facts, not at all a wise idea.
Yeah, he is trying to use this court case to further his campaign, as you would expect from Donald Trump. But the crux of this case does revolve around Trump overinflating the value of his property to get better interest rates. And the judge has already found him guilty on one of the 7 fraud claims. I just want to play some sound of what Michael Cohen, Trump's former attorney said during deposition.
So Mr. Trump would call Alan and I into the office, and let's say it said he was worth $6 billion. Well, he wanted to be higher on the Forbes list, and he then said, I'm actually not worth $6 billion. I'm worth 7. In fact, I think it's actually now worth 8 with everything that's going on. Alan and I were tasked with taking the assets, increasing each of those asset classes in order to accommodate that $8 billion number.
So, Joey, what else does the judge have to do to prove the rest of this case?
Yeah, so, look, that deposition testimony is compelling because what happens in any evaluation case is that it has to be tethered to reality. Certainly, there's certain subjective assessments that are made in valuing property, et cetera, but there are certain facts that can't be disputed. Either your property in terms of commercial space and size is 30,000 square feet or it's 10,000 feet. Either an apartment is rent controlled and thereby getting less than a free market apartment, or it's not. So those are factual assessments, and that's why the judge largely concluded there was fraud as to those issues. I think the judge will make other assessments, and what we just heard there from Michael Cohen, the president's former attorney, is very compelling as to the mindset and as to how the business practices were done. That's not how you should be doing business. It should be tethered, that is, valuations to reality. And so the judge has to assess whether this was going on, right? To what extent was it going on, and what really the consequences of this should be. The New York State Attorney General has not only a prosecutorial role as it relates to prosecuting crime in New York State, this is not a criminal case, but also a civil, right, relating to protecting businesses, other businesses, protecting consumers, protecting practices, consumers against deceptive business practices and fraudulent business practices. And so I think the judge has to make further conclusions as to fraud, and the judge ultimately, Lynda, has to make an assessment as to what the ultimate penalty would be. And that's why yesterday we heard from the accountant of Donald Trump, and that's why we'll hear from other witnesses, potentially expert witnesses, to talk about the property, the valuations, and what the benefits were to the Trump organization as a result of this inflation of values, and deflating when it was convenient too, to save taxes and other things. So far from over this trial, but that's what the judge will be assessing today and moving forward.
Yeah, Trump, as you point out, is accused of doing both inflating and deflating when it suited their purposes. But it was interesting to note what Trump's lawyer had to say. She said the value is what someone is willing to pay. The Trump properties are Mona Lisa properties. This is not fraud. This is real estate. What do you make of that defense?
So, look, I think that certainly when it comes to values, we live in a free market economy and society. And as a result of that, it is the real estate, what ultimately someone pays for it. But again, I think that you have to have, as we look there, the different valuations, but it has to be tethered, Lynda, to what the realities are, right? Either something is worth a certain amount, right, based upon practical accounting principles and based upon real estate valuations versus other properties, or it's not. You just can't walk into a room and say, I think it's $2 billion more. Not how it's done. And so you can make those arguments day and night. I should also note the judge sanctioned his attorneys. What does that mean? The judge fined his attorneys, his being Trump's attorney, $7,500 apiece, for making arguments that were disconnected with reality, and in his prior ruling indicated that this was a fantasy world. And so, yes, there's subjectivity, but subjectivity cannot fly in the face of facts and fly in the face of reality. And to the extent that that happens, you end up on a civil trial like this for fraud, where the consequences can be monumental in terms of not having the further ability to do any business in the state of New York.
Yeah, it's such a huge, huge case. Joey Jackson, always great to get you on the program. Good to get your analysis and perspective. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lynn.